Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is the panel where is focused on localization, but it's also the panel where your chair feels the hardest. I assure you, this is just an illusion. It will get better. We try to fight this perception. So thank you for coming and continuing our discussions. My name is Helen, and our focus is on localization, which was referred to a number of times over today. I know localization is a bit of a buzzword. The question has been raised also today already, whether it's actually happening. So there were tough questions about it already before we get to our discussion. So I think what is good also about our panel is that we have here people who represent different perspectives. We have somebody who's from among civil society, and also colleagues who are from among donors from the ground, donors in capitals. And aside or compared to the other two panels, we also have a concrete context. We want to look at localization in the context of Ukraine. I think that's something that is useful, but also poses the question how much you can generalize. So in terms of how we do or how well we do localization, also depends on how to define it. Rand Bargain has defined it as making or define it as a goal of making principled humanitarian action as local as possible and as international as necessary. So that is one definition. And I think the goal here has been to strengthen how much we invest and respect the role of local actors who are always the first responders. And then, as we have also seen, bear the most costs. So the question is rather now perhaps why to do localization, but how to do it. And if we are focused on localization, how does it interact with the rest of the humanitarian system? And what are its intended or unintended consequences, like, for example, as we brought out, the impact on the issue of coordination. So without any further ado, I'll introduce our panelists. We have here Roksolana Nesterenko. Roksolana works at the NGO Centre of United Action. You're a regional analyst, and the Centre cooperates with Ukrainian territorial communities to develop local public policies in the areas of healthcare, education, culture, waste management, and others. And the NGO also promotes citizen engagement and local decision-making. It conducts surveys, interviews with community stakeholders, and does trainings for local governments. She has also co-authored a research on civil society grassroots movements in Ukraine that emerged after Russia's full-scale invasion. So I think that's something that clearly links to what we're going to discuss today. Then we have here Oleg Masyk, who joined the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation after the outbreak of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine in 2022. He coordinates the Swiss humanitarian aid, protection, and health portfolios, and you focus on the most vulnerable populations in the east and southern regions of Ukraine. And before his current role, Oleg worked on capacity building and conflict prevention projects with various international organizations. You can mention here OSCE, NATO, and EBRD. And last but not least, I have Köhler. He's a diplomat, he's a public servant. Currently also head of division of multilateral policy on humanitarian assistance at the German Federal Foreign Office. So you shape the Germany's approach on global humanitarian matters. And before that, I know you have worked on export controls as well as human rights, and also worked with multilateral affairs, including in New York. So these are our speakers. It's a slightly different field here than in the previous panels, but I think also when colleagues mentioned or raised questions about government, I think now we also have a chance to bring in the government a little bit. So we agreed that we have some questions which are posed to specific panelists and some which are joint. So I would start with the first question to Roksolana. And the question is, when we have now discussion about localization, whether it's happening or not. So when you talk about Ukraine, is localization of humanitarian action real in Ukraine? And how has it changed over the last 1.5 years?
So actually, Localization is about Ukraine. So after our organization, after 24th of 2022, was one of the first responders to the crisis that emerged. So we have our own story about it, and I will shortly talk about it and what we did. Actually, on the second day of the full-scale war, our organization, people from our organization, when they evacuated to the safest places from Kyiv, they started to think what we can do about everything that happened. And the initiative came to, it was very quick to help communities, because we are, as you said, we were working with communities, territorial communities before the full-scale war, so we have connections with them. So what we can do better? Just to connect them and ask what they need. And they needed just simply mattresses and lining for people that came from parts of Ukraine that were under shelling, occupied, etc., and just simply things. And we asked our donors, and one donor said, okay, well, we will redirect these funds for us, that we can help the communities. So it worked like that. And then we purchased all these things and just gave it to communities. And it was a successful initiative because it involved 500 volunteers all over Ukraine. And it's also it's not like volunteer on, you do it all the day. Volunteers did it in many initiatives. So it could be one person did something like smallest, but it helped a lot. And then we understand that we did it through the 4 months. And then we understand that many other initiatives did the same or maybe much better. So we decided to return to our activities, just analytics and analysis of policies and helping the communities in other way. And here we now doing research, and we did it actually. After our experience, we did a research that showed, we had a question: why and what helped Ukraine to quickly respond on it, made a quick response on crisis. And then we understand that it's all about the civil society and the network between people. So we decided to research it, and we find out that about 130 initiatives, it's actually the smallest part. It's only initiatives that we reached out. And then we decided to think about what the most effective formats of the initiatives were, and then whom they helped, why they helped, and what resources they had. So we made a research on it, and maybe later in this discussion I will bring some interesting moments. If you ask, I can answer. So yeah, and we as an organization returned to what we did the best, research and helping with the policies for communities. So, thank you.
Thank you, Roksolana. And I think before we actually go to the questions, perhaps a good an intro from both Pete and Oleg on how you see the topic would be useful. Perhaps let's start from Oleg and then move over to Pete.
Yeah, thank you. So I work for Swiss Development Cooperation Office in Kyiv, and I consider myself lucky for work for a donor which is actually has this possibility to directly fund national NGOs, and this allows us to meet the partners on the ground, to see their challenges, and also to try to accommodate some of the needs they have. I think that localization for us started a long time ago in 2000, I think from 2015, even maybe earlier, because our development colleagues and the embassy have always been working with the national civil society organizations. So when the humanitarian aid portfolio unfolded at the embassy, and we were speaking about localization and we want to support national initiatives, our colleagues were saying, guys, but you are speaking about this like it's something new and it's something that we should do now, but this is already there. You just need to take the opportunity and go ahead with supporting these NGOs. So when we started actually going to the field and meeting these national organizations that we support, we really saw a big potential, but also a big gap in how this, the whole coordination of humanitarian system in Ukraine is organized. But it's not a surprise. Ukraine is a big country, and the front line today is about 1,200 kilometers. And all along this front line, you have this small civil society organizations who try to deliver humanitarian aid to the best extent possible. And also you have many international actors there. So it's a big challenge. But I think that good things are happening now, both in coordination and humanitarian aid delivery. So I'll be happy to talk a bit more.
Thank you. Pete.
Yeah, I'm happy to join actually this round because we are coming a bit from a different perspective. And sometimes I envy the Swiss colleagues because they have a completely different structure. And I feel sometimes that for you, it's much easier to do localization because you have teams in place that are really much bigger in terms of humanitarian assistance. But maybe let me start just by mentioning how much convinced we are that localization is the way to go, and that Ukraine is exactly the example where it proved why it is so important. Because I think first to see so many highly motivated local organizations doing a work that could not have been done, especially since the war broke out, by the international system as it was before. So in theory, but hopefully also in practice, we are convinced that localization is the way to go. But I want to be honest with you, for us as the second biggest donor, it's difficult. It's not always easy. Juliette mentioned this morning how important it is actually to make the system more efficient in terms of a growing funding gap. That's also our approach, and I think localization is the way to go, because otherwise you cannot make use of the full resources that you have, and second, you will not make progress on accountability for affected populations, really making sure that you deliver the aid that is needed on the ground. So that's absolutely essential for us. But what is our approach? Our approach is, because we can't fund local organizations directly in large numbers, because we have administrative hurdles first, because we have to do due diligence checks with all the organizations we would be working on, so we couldn't do this at a large scale. And the second thing is, because I want to be honest, is also a capacity issue for us. So what are we doing in order to overcome these challenges? First, we are very much committed to the grand bargain goal of delivering 25% at least at a minimum of aid funding as direct as possible, meaning with maximum one intermediary. And we are currently standing at 18%. We are not there yet, but we are trying to get there. So the grand bargain, where we are part of the steering group of the so-called facilitation group, last year came up with a working group that provided recommendations finally on how intermediaries actually could do localization much better. So how to make sure that local organizations get their share of the overhead costs, how to make sure that local organizations are being part of the design of the humanitarian response right from the beginning. So we were really involved in the discussions, making sure that there would be a substantial outcome. And now internally, we are trying to implement it. So we provided guidelines to all our missions abroad in order to make sure that in the field, they push the organizations, the intermediaries, in order to make sure that overhead costs are really passed on, and that local organizations are being seen eye to eye, and that they are part of the design of the response right from the beginning. The second element which we are working with very strongly is the country-based pooled funds, because we think the country-based pooled funds are a clear instrument for doing localization. They are a very good tool, and we're doing so very concretely with the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund, for which we have been the biggest donor since 2019. And is really good, for example, because the fund is having this small grants program where they have been able to reach and fund, I think, around like 300 local organizations. So that's the second element. And the third element, if I may say so, is the Red Crescent movement with its 191 national societies, as was mentioned before in the previous panels. For us, this has like a built-in component of localization already. So we had a standing cooperation with the German Red Cross, which in turn was working very closely with the Ukrainian Red Cross over time. So basically, that's the three components that we try to overcome the obstacles that we have.
Thank you. I think you've now kicked off and exactly seen what we have here. Like these are different perspectives, different viewpoints. So I'm kicking it right back to Pitt because we take advantage of Germany being here as one of the largest humanitarian donors. You've talked about the importance of localization for you. What is like, before we delve into Ukraine in particular, localization is a buzzword. In every humanitarian discussion that we have, it comes up and people say we should do it. What is your opinion, to the extent you can express it here, whether it's actually happening? Are we progressing with its implementation? How are our objectives vis-a-vis our real results from a donor perspective?
I guess in a nutshell, we are not there yet. I mentioned the numbers in the beginning. We were not able to meet the grand bargain threshold of 25% at least, and that's only as direct as possible. This is not really with working with local actors directly. But I think when I'm in the grand bargain discussions, actually, where localization is one of the two priority issues, there's not only big expectations, but there's also a huge understanding that things need to change. But I want to be honest with you. I mean, the humanitarian system, you probably all know, and Juliet knows best, probably is a big tanker. It's not so really easy to really steer its course and to get change overnight. And we should also not be afraid of managing expectations, because I think expectations are huge in terms of localizations. And again, we need to be honest. I think the established system, if I may call it that way, the UN system, has its advantages. It can scale up very quickly, for example, has highly professionalized staff that can deliver all kinds of services across the whole spectrum. What we really need is the right mix. We need the right mix, as I said in the beginning, in order to become more efficient and to be more focused on the targeted needs of the people on the ground, actually. So it's still a way to go. We have to manage expectations, but step by step we have to do so. Later on, maybe I can say a little bit more of what we try to do nationally in order to implement it.
And I think until then we had the slides, which was rather descriptive on the actual numbers as well. I think going now into the context of Ukraine and localization there, I think this is a question for both Oleg and Pete. Have donors really taken the opportunity to make use of the particular Ukrainian context that we have? We have a resilient, very motivated civil society, as also Roksolana pointed out. We have a functioning government structures. We have digital capacity. Have we taken this opportunity to use localization to implement it?
So I would, in short, describe it as work in progress. I think that we can look, there was a localization baseline done by a national Ukrainian NGO, which is called NGO-RC, which looked at a little bit about, which did interviews with the NGOs about the main challenges that they face in Ukraine. And the two main challenges for them are funding and policy making. So since the funding is the main challenge for the NGO and it's very far from being a good result, I would say that donors are not there yet. And this is actually related to what Pete mentioned about the policies of donors, which do not allow really work with the national actors. So there are different mechanisms as pool funds, for example, which is a great start. I think the UHF allocation for national organizations, the last one was about 50% of funds went to the national ones, which is great. But if you look into the details, the requirements for these small NGOs to benefit from this fund are so complex that the small organizations, they simply have no time, even not even to speak about the knowledge of how to properly submit the documents, write a project proposal, which is also a big gap. But just because these people these organizations are understaffed and they are working 24 hours per 7, they don't even have time for these things to be written. So my message is that procedures should be simplified when it is possible. For example, in the case of the SDC, we have a flexible policy in this regard. For well-established NGOs, we required a whole package of documents, a very good due diligence, etc. But for the small organizations, we are more flexible and our demands are less strict, let's say. Of course, we still do due diligence. We are trying to make sure that humanitarian aid is principled. But the procedure is simplified, which allows us to work with these NGOs. And also another instrument that we use is some sub-granting mechanism. So we give a big grant to a big national NGO, which then distributes this to small national NGOs. And this is actually a very effective mechanism because we saw that with 5,000 or 30,000 of Swiss francs, these NGOs can do a lot, really a lot. Another big gap was capacity building. So what we did, we gave these grants, but also we accompanied these NGOs with capacity building to explain them what we mean by humanitarian aid, because this is a separate question, right? In Ukraine, we can also discuss how it is perceived, what humanitarian aid is perceived. So we provide capacity building with what is principled humanitarian aid, but also how to build internal policies of the organizations. And this support that we give allows them to apply for additional funding from other partners, but also having the backup of Switzerland also gives them a better picture in front of the other donors, and other donors would be more eager to fund these organizations. So I think there is a lot of things that donors can do. Try to a little bit play with these internal regulations, which are, of course, very difficult, but I think that things could be done better. And but now I think that also the organizations also noticed themselves that they are underfunded, and also because they are very fragmented and they don't have a single voice in Ukraine, etc. So I think that now the organizations themselves started to build alliances to be more vocal and to also to be able to access these big donors in Ukraine.
I think it's good to see a viewpoint of one donor and also somebody who takes active or proactive steps. But of course, it's difficult to evaluate the lay of the land in total, but it's a good perspective. Bit on the German side.
Yeah, first, let me underline that we are completely convinced that what the advantages are of local actors, and Ukraine is a very good example and point, as I mentioned in the beginning. The local organizations, first, they are highly motivated, they speak the language, they know what people need, they share the values of people on the ground, and very often they even have better access because they are very often very close to the front lines or even in the occupied territories. At the same time, we also recognize that there are huge challenges. For example, many of the organizations are pretty new. Volunteer networks have not been able to really establish more like a solid structure as such, not being able to hire people on a long term. And they also have to fight bureaucracy, as in any country. They have to make sure that they are registered, they have to do the taxation, the reporting, all these kinds of things. So what we realized also is that one trigger point where we can really do something, in addition to the measures that I mentioned at the beginning, like, for example, the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund or the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement with its local presence, we need to make sure that part of the overhead costs is going to the local organizations. And this is actually where I mentioned in the beginning, we have these guidelines and we are pushing our partners really hard in order to pass on part of the overheads, because overheads would allow to hire staff more permanently, to do capacity building, to do training and institutionalize this more. Actually, that's what we are trying to do. But as I said in the beginning, it's not easy. But sometimes, just in order to give you an example, there are some successes. For example, in Ukraine, we are working with 16 larger international organizations, which in turn work with 73 local organizations. So by doing this, we are able to spread out even more and have a cascading effect in a way.
Thank you. So now it's a reality check. How do we see things from the civil society side?
That's interesting because I have what to say on every point and agree with many of them about localization. So when I was thinking about what the main factors that connected to localization in Ukraine, it's the territory, as you said, the dense network of activists, and the absence of bureaucratic procedures on the informal level. So every of these factors had its pros and cons. So the first is territory. It's more territory, you need more local actors. And it's actually very natural they appear naturally. So because there is a lot of people that connected to the issues. One of them are IDPs. We had a conversation with people that created their initiatives after they became an IDPs. So they understand that they need to do something. So they came to other part of Ukraine and started to gather other people together. So it was firstly very informal. So the dense network is also, we need to point that Ukraine had the network of activists before 2022. So when the Russia state started the war in 2014, so many people became an IDPs and also started to gather in activists, just activist circles, and also the Revolution of Dignity. And it's everything that it will steps until we understand that this network is really working when the full-scale war began. And the absence of bureaucratic procedures is actually, it creates flexibility, adaptability to different issues. So for example, people ask you as an activist, you're an activist, and people ask you to bring something like some goods. You need, for example, mattresses, but then you understand you need something else. And you just simply call these activists, and everything just changes immediately, and people just connected one to other. And it became a style of living for many volunteers. But of course, all these factors had some negativity that connected to internal, external factors. And for example, territory, it's occupation, the occupation, shelling, so it's always changing landscape. And you understand that volunteers just, they are seeking for new ways of evacuation for people, for example, or delivering the humanitarian aid for the settlements near the front line. So everything is changing, but the people are very adaptable to this. So it's a reality for Ukraine to just territory is always shelling, so under shelling. About the network, our research found that half of initiatives that we interviewed addressed problems in 2 or more spheres. So they worked not only with humanitarian aid to just IDPs or people under in the settlements that were under the shelling. They also helped the military, just simply soldiers, because it was for example, my friend and I helped them, help my friends, or my colleagues that were mobilized to the army. So it was very close to each other, and it's also became a problem because when you are working with only humanitarian aid, it's one point of view. But when you are working also for military many donors will say to you that it's not our policies are not about this. So I can't give you the funds. I can't fund these activities because one another. So, but many of initiatives understand this, and they try to focus only on one activity, like humanitarian aid or just simply military aid. So its differentiation became real. So it's much more easier now to work with some NGOs or initiatives that then became an NGO. So many of them, we found out that out of 131 initiative, more than half of the transformed initiatives just to became an NGOs or just became more local or decided they only have like one target audience, not like after the full-scale war began and everyone helped everyone. So it became much more easier for NGOs, if initiative became an NGO, it's much more easier them to have funding from donors and also just live in a legal area, so they are legal. It's not just a simply network of friends, etc. So it's about the main points that you said. So the civil society of Ukraine understand what they need to do to have help from other countries, from other people, because we understand that it's a little bit chaotic was firstly, like everyone doing something, and it was very just quick actions to solve the problem here and now. But then people, of course, like institutionalized their activities and became more aware that they're living not only inside of Ukraine, but they're connected to other countries that can help us. So we need to provide them information that they need to provide us assistance.
I think what you have also shown is the dynamics. We have really like seen a change both in the society, civil society, whether it's good for or bad. I think there's been a strong push in terms of motivation that we have seen. Oleg already pointed out the challenge regarding capacity. So what is your view? What are the challenges for the civil society, Roksolana, in terms of capacity? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges?
So the capacity is growing because you understand that we have much more. We did so many things, just an aid and analytics on what we did, and civil society understand that they grow in a process of this everything that connected with humanitarian crisis, and capacity is growing, and actually many of initiatives communicate with the local governments, and the capacity of local governments are also growing up. So it's very interesting how they connected to each other, because I can talk about initiatives without the mention of local governments, because they did a lot. Like the local businesses, local governments, and the civil society, it was like activists, volunteers, or just NGOs. It was like a big network, and they did everything just to help the people, the communities, and they are growing. The capacity of them are just growing, and I think it will continue to be like that.
Thank you. I think when we go into the specific context of Ukraine and a very intense conflict that still continues, I think the issue of transfer risk, which also came up earlier today, is very relevant. Localization involves a potential for a larger transfer risk to local actors, which is an immediate concern in this context. How can the donors manage it the best way, and how do you see their duty of care in this context? Oleg?
So I think that yes, one of the important points of why localization needs to happen and is happening in Ukraine is the question of access, because international organizations have also security regulations and rules which do not allow them to access territories which are very close to the front line. But national organizations and volunteer groups have been doing it already since the 24th of February of 2022. So I think that here, this is why localization is important, because this is the only way to access the people who live there, who are still there, and who need this humanitarian assistance. So in our case, for example, we developed a fair partnership policy, which we provide to our international partners and organizations. It's very similar, I think, to what you said, Pete, when you ask your partners to take into account certain things like overhead, etc. We also do that with this policy, and we ask our partners when they work with national NGOs. To make sure that the people who are there are protected. First of all, they are protected with helmets and protective vests. They also get the psychological support. By the way, this is something that didn't come up at the beginning of the conflict. This is something that we learned a bit later, that people who work 24/7 in this difficult context also need psychosocial support, right? They are providing this, but they themselves also need it. So we ask our partners to protect this NGOs. And also very important initiative that we have and we consider very relevant is insurance. Ukraine, for those who know Ukraine, you may know that insurance is not common in Ukraine. People are not insured, just like, if I may say so. When we first met with the volunteers and we were speaking about that, and my Swiss colleagues just asked, are you guys insured because you are going into these dangerous locations? And they said, no, we are not insured. It was like normal reaction. And that was very surprising for the Swiss colleagues because it's almost, they are breaking the law if they're not insured. So in this case, we decided, so this is how we decided actually that we can try to do something with this. And we now, with a local partner in Kharkiv Oblast, which is called Relief Coordination Center, we provide 2,000 of life and accident insurance for the volunteer groups who works there. And I think it's a good initiative, and it was taken up forward by other national NGOs which do policy making, and now they are advocating for the tax exemption for this on the insurance policies for the volunteers. This is a pilot project, and we would like probably to replicate it in other oblasts as well. And the next task for us will be to think how to make it sustainable if the conflict will last longer. And probably we need to think about some more sustainable solutions.
I'm kind of piqued by the specific reference that also Roksolana made about the organizations learning what is humanitarian and what is not. And I know that in our previous discussion, Oleg also mentioned, so perhaps I follow on on Oleg's point here, is humanitarian action is underpinned by internationally recognized humanitarian principles, and then we have the four main ones. We have good humanitarian donorship ones. To what extent does localization provide an opportunity to build support to these principles, and to what extent it can pose a risk to their dilution? I think Roksolana has made an example that there's been a learning process and a bit of a clarifying in a system, but I wonder what you think on this.
So, yes, I think that in our case, Ukrainian case, as you mentioned, is very special because even Ukrainian legislation says that humanitarian aid is basically everything which is provided for free. So people bring cars for militaries as humanitarian aid for militaries, and this is how it all started. And it sounds also like funny, but it was very important, I think, at the at the beginning of the full-scale invasion for the local volunteers to have this opportunity. And this is what also prevented them at some point to get this funding from the donors to make sure the humanitarian aid is delivered in a principled way. So I think that, as I already mentioned, capacity building here is key, but also due diligence process. So we work with partners who provide due diligence for these organizations, but we also provide training on humanitarian aid. And I think that it's important to mention that there is always a risk here, because these national NGOs, as Roksolana mentioned, they are trying to help everyone, because everyone needs help, right, in Ukraine. So I think that Switzerland takes some risk here as well in Ukraine, because we also understand that our main goal is to reach the populations, the civilian populations which live in the frontline areas. And this is something important for us. So we are taking this risk, but we are trying to do as much as possible to prevent any deviations.
No, Roksolana?
Oh, actually, there is a lot to say about the NGOs, Ukrainian civil society, and about humanitarian actions. As I said, the many things could be done not only through NGOs, but through local authorities. Mm-hmm. And why I think it's good, as the previous panelist said, that about the asking for information, for like you need to ask information in communities where you work in. So the main their data collector in these communities are the local authorities. So it would be very easy to work with them, because they know everyone, almost like everything that connected with services, civil services, are connected to the local authorities, like IDP certificates, for example, everything that connected with their location, accommodation for IDPs, for example, everything that connected with humanitarian aid also came, they are processing it. If something, for example, are not only from government, but from, for example, from local businesses, or not local businesses, mm-hmm. like the national businesses I came from, are processing in the local authorities. So they could be a very good medium, because, as Oleg said, they're the NGOs, local NGOs are small. They are capable to help the certain amount of people, but they need to be helped by the other local actors, and this is local governments. So it would be very helpful to work not only with NGOs, but make an alliance between the local actors and local NGOs and local authorities, so they could work together, and they will help a lot, because these people are working with the citizens on the ground, and they know everything about their needs. And you don't need to, you just need to ask someone from the, for example, department that connected to social issues, everything like that. So you can connect this person and then ask what your community need. Is your community, for example, we had a community, a territorial community in our research that were, when IDPs came there, the actual amount of people just tripled, because there is a small community of 5,000 people, and then they 15,000 people, and then a lot of IDPs. So they know what this IDPs really need, and you just ask them, or just phone them or something like that. And it's about what donors could do, and we will talk about maybe it later, mm-hmm. What donors could do to work with the local actors much more productively.
I think you have also pointed out very specific one, this enabling condition, which is in Ukraine, is this cooperation with government and local government at different levels, and how it has enabled to both collect, analyze information, also provide assistance. So I think later we come to the point of to what extent this travels, but I think here it's a strength that should be used. Going back to the general question that was posed when we phrased the objective of our panel was, localization is one of our objectives. It's a good thing. It's aimed for greater efficiency, for greater reach. One of the unintended consequences you broaden the bottom-up approach, but you also increase the risk or the potential for fragmentation and less coordination. To what extent you have felt this challenge in working in Ukraine, and how have the UN, of course, and the other actors been able to address it, to respond to it in a situation where you should make use of the fact that you have so many local actors, but at the same time maintain a good overall picture? So I would ask that question from everyone, but I don't know. I start from Pete and then move on to others.
I mean, it would be interesting to hear the analysis of colleagues from on the ground, actually, on how they see coordination. I just imagine that coordination must be a real challenge, to be honest, because you need to coordinate at the national level, you need to coordinate at the local level. Ideally, you also coordinate on thematic issues. So this must be a huge task. And I think Roksolana described it in a very interesting way, on a very nice way, how the humanitarian response evolved also. And of course, at the beginning, everyone just started working, and then you realize probably there's a need for coordination because there's so much local and international response. But also the scale of the humanitarian situation is so big in Ukraine, because if I'm not mistaken, it's around 17 million people that need humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. So this is really a huge humanitarian situation. So there must be huge challenges for coordination, I imagine. For us, as a big donor, of course, we want to have a coordinated system, because a coordinated system with a proper needs assessment and with a cluster coordinated responses and efficient system, we very much support OCHA's role in doing so, in really coordinating the system. I'm not really sure if OCHA is able to do so all the time and to be up to the challenges, but I also say these are unprecedented challenges. We work with them and support their pilot projects in order to get really better on coordination, in order to make sure that they also come closer to the needs of the affected populations. You might have heard about these flagship projects, which are going on in 4 pilot countries, where they really try to go at the sub-national level, at the local level, in order to do area-based coordination, in order to make sure that the needs of the people are really being addressed. And then, of course, it would be interesting to do so on a larger scale and to apply the findings and the learnings also to other contexts. But I can also imagine, that's the OCHA side, that's the coordination side, but I also imagine that for civil society, of course, it might be helpful to get organized, and you're doing this is what you referred to provide platforms which makes it easier to articulate yourself and to also interact with the system.
Thank you. Roksolana.
Yeah, about what the other side, the donors, the people who can help, can do. I was thinking about it as researcher, first of all, because when we are not giving the humanitarian aid now for the people, but we can help with understanding these complex processes that happen they are evolving all the time. And the first is about what should donors do is to make a on-the-ground analysis, what the people really need. So it should be done before the situation happened, because I know from the friend of mine in this field that it was, for example, a situation with Kakhovka Dam that blew up, and then this aid that they need to be received much more earlier than they just came with the water pumps for just to help the water to be like transferred, but then they realized that the water just went down, and it was like a few weeks after the real need. So they, for quicker response, it should be less bureaucracy, but how to do, it's maybe the people, like the representatives of the donors should like to understand how they need to make less obstacles for the NGOs to engage in cooperation. And then also about what not to, to forget, because I wrote it down, and also I said about the analysis, about the bureaucratic procedures, and also about the making a contact base of local NGOs. So the donors should make, for example, like in the base of these local actors, and they need to check their organizational capacity and maybe make a less harsh, how it's called, the points for like to be
Requirements.
yeah, yes, thank you so much. Yes, requirements for requirements for the NGOs, because not everyone, not every NGO have it on the local level, because you understand it could be NGO that consists of 4 people or like 10 people. It's a small amount, but it's actually, they are very effective. They could be very effective, these 4 people, because they're like working, as you said, like 24 hours a day, and they are really aimed on making like the things changed by themselves. So also, what I say, yes, and ask for financial evidence, because there could be different frauds, of course, because we are living in a crisis situation, and there could be people that want to, they want to be part of this funding sharing process, and you understand that it could be people that are not very good, as I said, yeah. So donors should just be a fact checker themselves, so they need to do a very big work, but a lot of NGOs, established NGOs, could help them to do this. So the fact-checking, because they have contacts of different NGOs on the ground, so it could always be a very like process of communication between different people. And in Ukraine, it happened very quick, because many people knows each other because of the crisis that happened. Many people just moved from one city to another, just became acquaintances from the activist community, I mean. And it's really helpful, because you can ask for information on your, like, just call it or type it to someone and ask something. It's very, in Ukraine, it works very well.
I think you have put like a very local perspective next to very large donors, and let's say try to make the 2 pictures kind of work together. But I think it's not a very unique situation. On the fragmentation and coordination challenges, Oleg.
Yes, I think that the last statistics I saw on the number of Ukrainian charitable organizations, this is the official legal definition of humanitarian organizations in Ukraine, was 28,000. So when you also add the number of international actors, that I think that vast majority of them are present now in Ukraine, that makes the coordination really difficult, of course, but also there is opportunities there, because there are national NGOs who also coordinate themselves, etc. So I think that when the conflict started in 2022 and international organizations and OCHA started to unfold their activities, the UN came with its standard cluster system, and it started to apply it in Ukraine. but also they needed huge capacities to make sure that it works. And these national NGOs in parallel, they didn't know that it existed. So they invented their own thing. I just wanted to ask colleagues to show an example of coordination initiative on the screen, if possible. So this will be an example of a regional coordination initiative in Kharkiv region, implemented by a local NGO, which is called Relief Coordination Centre. Exactly, this is why they did it, because aid was delivered by every small volunteer organizations and families, etc., a bit everywhere. And they just wanted to know what is going where, because there were cases where people were receiving food supplies 3 times. So if you can zoom out just a little bit to see the map of Ukraine, just to locate a little bit. Yeah, so you can see Ukraine, and then in the east you can see these dots. And if you could zoom in, please. Now. Yes, on these dots, and this is what this organization did. They actually did a coordination system. If you click on any of those, you will see they track how they track the information. So they have the name of the community, the number of people who live there, the total coverage of humanitarian needs, at some different type of data, and also the data who delivered aid, when it was delivered. And the contact, they also, I know that they have contact numbers of the community leaders who live there. So if anyone wants to reach out, they could also contact this organization and continue. So this initiative was very effective for the local coordination, actually, at the regional level. And then OCHA also discovered that this organization existed, and this organization also discovered that OCHA exists in Ukraine. And now they came together. And this is a good, actually, example. So now things work together, and I think the OCHA made a great effort to accommodate this also coordination system. But also there are still some challenges in coordination, of course, because of how to engage local authorities, this UN cluster-based system. But the biggest challenges are for national NGOs to plug into this system, I think. First of all, because of the language issue. Very simply, people don't speak English. Here, OCHA also made a great progress, because now all the cluster meetings are translated into Ukrainian for the organizations to be able to participate. But then the second coordination challenge comes when even if you understand the words, you cannot really understand how things work. And this is a great challenge, coordination challenge that we hear from the national partners. So I think that there should be more work done in terms of how to make sure that the messages pass through and the organization can really understand how things work. I remember just an example that there was one organization saying that there was a coordination meeting and everyone talked about the localization and nothing happened. So yeah, there is this challenge on how to make sure that things are following up and coordinated.
Mm-hmm. I think it's wonderful to see that there's actually a living parallel to the cluster system, which has existed in the near past, and now it works with OCHA. It's too bad we don't have a UN colleague here. It would be interesting to hear that perspective and compare it and see what also perhaps UN could learn from this. Which kind of leads me to the next oral or joint question is, Ukraine is a specific case. There's a strong national NGO network. There was strong also initiative that developed into actual civil societies. And there's been it's a practice which is a good practice. So the question is, to what extent those lessons learned and good practices that we have seen over the last 18 months, to what extent it can provide lessons more on localization more generally? Is it such a specific context that nothing can be learned, or is there something that we can take from this and expand it on broader localization throughout the world through different crises?
That's actually a good question, because
the example of Ukraine is maybe, as you said, exceptional because it's a large territory. A lot of people just became an IDPs. We are facing, it's a crisis that are always with us because we are like, the cities are shelled always, and you could be a target not only in like the front line, but in Kyiv, other cities on the west part and south, of course. And what I want to say that maybe the main lessons from Ukrainian case for other countries that are facing humanitarian problems and they need aid, the key is the making a network of people that are connected not only formally but informally. You just need to make these connects with people, and you need to connect different stakeholders together, like the business, the NGOs, the local government, as I said. So if country have this, there is much more, like there is less, I want to say, the problem will become much more easier to solve if the many actors are connected, because you can have some resources because you know someone that have this. So it became, like in Ukraine, it happened, as I said, rapidly. Everyone just started to make a post in social media, if you have this or if you have that. And then it became institutionalized, and these connections should be the main key for everything, because it's about resources and it's about the time of action. It became much more quicker. So it's like that.
Peter or Oleg, who wants to go first?
Yeah, maybe just very quickly. I can imagine that Ukraine provides the right examples in order to give a real impulse to localization and to really make sure that it's being put on a new level, but to also be prepared for future crises in order to have instruments on how to work with large groups of civil society actors. I think that could be one of the lessons learned. But on the other hand, I think also, I'm definitely not an expert on Ukraine. I think that the example of Ukraine is quite specific because you have a working administration, you have lots of volunteer organizations with a high capacity that have been working also before, at least since 2014, also in the occupied territories. So it's a little bit a mix of the two different things. So there are definitely lessons learned for the system as such, but also, of course, about the challenges on how to coordinate such large numbers of volunteer organizations and civil society organizations. But at the same time, I think the example is quite specific and cannot be really like duplicated in other contexts, like one-to-one. So it has to be a bit context specific, I imagine. But it's of course a convincing example why we need to get better on localization and have the right instruments on coordinating with local societies.
Oleg?
I would just add that this human capital here is the key, especially in Ukrainian case, because the capacities are already there and they deliver humanitarian aid. These skills that these organizations have and also are gaining with the support of international partners, they are transferable, and for the recovery context, for example, then the same people will also be rebuilding Ukraine, and also will be making some also other projects. So investing in local human capital here, and probably in other contexts as well, will also lead to more sustainable solutions for the future.
I really want to add about, I came to my mind when you said about the before 2022, what happened in Ukraine. There was a decentralization reform, and it really like changed the landscape of everything that's connected to funds, because the local authorities became the one who decide what to do with, for example, educational system like the schools. They became much more responsible for everything that happened on their territory, and for people, and for funding the services for these people. So it was really that point that changed this localization became real, because people need to be to work on the problems, on the issues that face the community, not only for example, the region, oblast, but the community is the smallest part, the smallest one, and this just make this base for all these networks that I said before.
I think, yeah, the common element in your responses has been the human element as well, the richness and the kind of the basic network that provided. And I wanted to also pick up one point from Oleg that we don't have the time to go into this further, but we see parallel now humanitarian aid and reconstruction, and I think the connecting element will be the local organizations and communities here, because they won't leave, they are there. So as we go on, progress to the stage of reconstruction, then that remains equally important. So I think the networks that have been built in the humanitarian field will also carry on further there. But I think that's a discussion already for another ESTDEV organized conference. With that, I would open the floor for questions to our panelists. And I think I would also encourage you to make use of the fact that we have different perspectives here. We have colleagues from government, colleagues from civil society, and I think challenge them if you still feel it after the end of the long day. That's the thing at the second part of any conference. The number of questions goes down. So I see one over there. Okay.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting perspectives. My question is a little bit about the pooled funding as potential means to allow for localization, basically. So you mentioned it, but it was brought up a couple of times. Just first, a reflection on, well, I used to work with Start Network, and Start Fund has a pooled funding mechanism whereby NGOs can become part of the decision-making process, essentially. So the funding is given by the donor, but the decision is made by the NGOs themselves. And I see a great value in that, because it also gives agency. It's not just a means of finding the funding, but it's like built-in coordination, because the NGOs are then finding out about each other, their strengths and their weaknesses, and that's a kind of benefit. But my question is about where you see pooled funding going in the future, is perhaps expanding a little bit on this idea of the flagship initiative, which I believe could change the way in which funding at the moment is channeled. And we saw in Juliet's slides just the lack of funding going to local NGOs. Perhaps there are different levels of pooled funds, of course, UN, NGOs, and the Red Cross has its own draft. But yeah, how do you see the future, and how do you see your Switzerland and Germany's contribution to that?
Thank you. I see that question heading towards Pitt, but there was another one that I would take, and then we go to responses. Okay, there's two more.
Yes, there is another one here. Natalia acted. So speaking of the coordination system, it's gaps and exclusion, actually, for the local partners. Namely, I would mention the cash working group, and there is a total exclusion for the local partners linked to this limitation for in-person participation in the cash working group meetings only. So there is an idea, an initiative to create the platform for local actors to be able to coordinate. So just curious to hear what you think, whether it would be something reasonable, effective, and feasible to create it for local partners in Ukraine to coordinate for cash, but not limited to cash response only.
Thank you. I'll take a third one from over there. Is there a fourth question, or then we'll do it in the next round? Yes. Can you take
Thank you so much, dear experts, dear Ukrainian colleagues, and also Mr. Pete. So I have two questions, but they are very interconnected. So the first is for my Ukrainian colleagues. How would you estimate which key criteria should show non-governmental organizations as well as civic society organizations to our future donors to persuade them in our transparency, just to make our donors be sure in our clarity means? Because, like, for example, every non-governmental organization or civil society organization can have its own rules, you know, how to show in their transparency and so on. And also, like, very connected question to Mr. Pitt. So how would you estimate what we are to show, which criteria persuading you, I mean Germany and other countries of the European Union, that we are clear, that we are not corrupted, and we are the guys who are to trust? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we go to questions. I have one on pooled funding, which I start from Pete. Perhaps you can also take the question on transparency, and I think Oleg can chip in here. And on the issue of creation of a local partners coordination platform, perhaps Roksolana and Oleg can pitch in. Pete?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the question on pooled funds, because Germany is a big fan of the pooled funds. We think when we always say that the pooled funds, in our view, are like the drivers of innovation, because you can really cause like systematic, or you can trigger and push systemic change, like, for example, make sure that there's enough money for gender-based violence or for gender at all in humanitarian assistance. You can do that for anticipatory action, which is very important for us, actually, for Germany. And we are working very closely with the START network, financing activities and projects on anticipatory action, which is also very important in terms of becoming more efficient for the system to make each dollar last longer, because actually it allows us to act before a crisis hits. That's something that's very important. And of course, localization, we were talking about this. So those are things where pooled funds can really work as drivers of change, of innovation, and make sure that they use their power of pooled funds not only in order to spend the money in a flexible way, which is quality funding, which is very good, and which we always try to support, but also in order to push systemic change. So big fans actually on the pooled funds. At the same time, we as a donor, we are always being asked and controlled by Parliament. So we need to also have the information and the reporting in order to make sure that when a crisis hits, we'll be immediately able to say where our money is going and how much money we have spent on that crisis. So there's a certain contradiction where the Grand Bargain is working on also, which is more or less on the way reporting can be done. And I think our partners can also help us in order to provide us the numbers and the individual examples, also in terms of our public relations work that we are doing in order to make sure how we are people helping on the ground, which is not so easy if you are providing big chunks of your money through the pooled funds. But at the same time, for us, you might have seen that Germany started as a very small donor like 10 years ago. And we multiplied the money that we were able to provide thanks to the very clear decision making by Parliament. We are able to scale up our support for the humanitarian system also thanks to the pooled funds, because that's the way where you can spend the money in a way that is quality funding, but also make sure that you address the systemic issues and also local preferences, for example, local decisions when you talk about the country-based pooled funds, where always Germany tries to be in the boards and make sure that they really implement the things that I have just mentioned as being drivers of change.
Oleg, do you want to add something on this, on the pooled funds, or rather on the transparency question?
Yeah, on the second, on the criteria, I think that I can add a few words that I think that for small local organizations, it's important, first of all, to register themselves as an organization. This is the first step. because there are also many volunteer groups who would also like to be supported, and it's also being done, but it will be easier, of course. It's a must to be registered to get the funding from a donor. And then I think that have a proper accounting system, not a system, but accountant who will be able to present just the budget in a proper way will be also something of very important. And I think that the small organizations may try with a small grant, first of all, to receive from a donor for a small project. And then once it is completed, then probably apply for some more important grants. And once this stage is completed, I think that audit is important. Donors like audits, and they always ask for audits. And we see this as a challenge for the local organizations because they don't do audits, they don't have money, they don't have time. So now there are also projects also that are funded by us, which will do audit for the organization, just for them to have it and to be able to present to the donor, because this is a requirement. I think it's an important step. And I think very important thing is just to have a very clear idea of what you want to do, not spreading too much your activities, but focusing on one specific sector. Usually when you talk to donor and present an idea, if it is clear and you know what you do, I think that donors will be happy to support this idea. Yes, and then of course there are different capacity building initiatives in Ukraine. I think you could easily find something to know how to write a concept note, a project proposal, and I think this is also something that would be beneficial.
Thank you. Roksolana.
The coordination platform or platform for NGOs, first of all, it should not be forced, because in Ukraine something that is forced is not working good. And how it should be better created, because I knew that we have some coalitions of the NGOs, but it not work good in Ukraine, because many of NGOs are very competitive, especially that who have some story and some like more than 10 years of activity, etc. And so what criteria for this coordination, cooperation platform should be? It should be, first of all, something like a gathering of thoughts in some fields. So maybe some meetings, but it actually required time, and not every NGO have this time for like additional talks, and we understand that the action is much more better than just talking about problems, because we need to solve them like rapidly. So it should be initiated by the NGOs that want to be the connectors between them, because we need someone who be the responsible one for collecting all these thoughts. And then it should be, actually, I don't know, because it's very like futuristic question. And maybe then it happened like naturally, because some of them just fall off and some decide to stay. And then the NGOs just became a coalition. So it's a very complex process. It's not like one answer on how to do it better. It's like the combination of many things. Like, for example, time. Do these organizations have time for just coming together with others and talk, or just they are much better as an individual, like individualistic, this organization only that connected to one community, for example, or just target audience that are much more smaller than all, for example, pool of IDPs of Ukraine, etc. So they are very competitive.
I think, you pointed out 2 pointed things that actually localization might do is also increase competition between the NGOs. They are that are functioning locally. But I think the points that you have also made, there are certain restraints as to coordination or participation in the coordination, whether it's like physical presence, because the area of activity is somewhere else. So I think these are good points, and it would be lovely to also have a continuation of discussion with the multilateral organizations on the spot to see what works best. Because I think what Ukraine has also shown is that we shouldn't be stuck to old models. So if there's a challenge to the old model, whether it's a cluster or a coordination platform, then I think we can challenge it and also challenge it elsewhere. I think that's kind of I'm not agreeing here, as you see, with Pete's very strict conclusion that we can't export the lessons learned. Do I see further questions? We have 5 more minutes. Yes, Mari. I think that.
Thank you. My question is maybe mostly to Roksolana, that Ukraine is a huge country, and as you were researching this local response, were there also differences between the regions, or was it more or less the same pattern everywhere?
Mm-hmm. In our research, we covered mostly the parts of Ukraine that are safer for our journalists. So we didn't research on Kharkiv region, for example, as Oleg showed us, and we didn't research this part that connected to the active battles, activities, and everything. So we research mostly the western and the northern part of Ukraine, and also the occupied territories after the Kyiv region, Sumy region, Chernihiv regions near there. So I can say about all of Ukraine, because of course we didn't have information, but there is no such drastic differences. Maybe more evacuation initiatives were in the nearest to this western and eastern, eastern and southern part of Ukraine. They were occupied and occupied. So actually, there is no such difference between what people did, because, as I said, many IDPs came from the part of Ukraine, like the northern part, for example, to the western, and they did what they decided, or much more like it was a general things to do. For example, the accommodation for IDPs, the humanitarian aid for them, the evacuation process, everything that connected those. Many people from Western Ukraine came to the Eastern just to evacuate, because they, other people, because they have the transportation for these purposes. So there's so much different types of initiatives. I just covered a little, the most common, because in every community there were a headquarter for the humanitarian aid, volunteer aid. So almost in every community. I traveled to one of our partner community on the western part of Ukraine, and they have on their, we have this Soviet houses of culture in many, this is the smallest villages, and there's a lot of space for these headquarters, and they did there just for many things for IDPs, and also the military aid and the food for soldiers, but it's another part of, we didn't cover it. And what I want to say, there's some kind of this rapid response in many parts of Ukraine simultaneously, so there's not such difference all over Ukraine.
Thank you. We say one last question there.
Hi. Am I allowed rather a comment and encouragement? Is that okay? or you would like a question?
But Karin was very strict about this. But it's the last one. I think
It's the last
it
one.
strikes a good tone in it.
I hope it does, because this has been a super valuable discussion, and it's something that in EGA, in eGovernance Academy, we have been trying out with a project in the last 2 years that we just finished. I'll say it very briefly what it was about, and then the key lessons that perhaps could help Pete to overcome some of his suspicions, and definitely encourage what Roksolana has been saying, and also what Oleg was saying at the beginning. The focus there wasn't humanitarian aid, though. It was digital vulnerability, but it doesn't really matter. The point was, we applied to the funder who trusted us with money. And then we had a local partner in Georgia and local partner in Ukraine, who we worked to have a research in both countries to see what mainly causes digital vulnerability and how to deal with it. And then we chose several organizations, civil society organizations, and government people and local government people to work together through a capacity building program to design their responses, how they would like to deal with it in their local small communities, and chose 3 proposals, 1 in Georgia and 2 in Ukraine because of the war. We put more attention to Ukraine. And we finished this with amazing results, because the donor trusted us, we trusted the partners, and all together we trusted the local organizations who for 10,000 or 5,000 or 20,000 euros achieved results which us or Federal Foreign Office Germany or Swiss Embassy would never achieve, because probably half of the 10,000 would go to our own overheads. But there it went there. But the key lesson there was, we were the ones who reported all the financials. We didn't ask local partners and local organizations, the small organizations who were working in the local field, any sort of financial proof of how they spent the money. We said, we are not asking you to prove what you did with what you spent the money, but what you achieved with it. So we turned the tables and said, give us your value proposition. What it is that you can achieve with 10,000 euros in Kryvyi Rih, for example, or in Hocha community, or in other places. And that's what they did. So that was one thing. We should stop tracking every single cent that local organizations are using and put the trust in middle organizations like EGA or somebody else. We know how to do this, but we have to trust people. And the 2 other lessons is, all these small local projects that we funded were left amazing legacies, because this is what we asked from the very beginning. It shouldn't be a one-off thing, but show how you can continue working on those topics in the future, which all of them are doing, although our funding ended. They have turned them into services where they can actually make money, which is ideal for a civil society organization, or big it into a bigger scale project, or work together with local governments, getting money from local governments to do those things. So that's the ideal thing. And the third component, which is super important, where cooperation comes into place. Us, the partners, and the local organizations built a very strong digital tool-based monitoring, evaluation, and learning network. So we could constantly see what was being achieved, not who bought a cup of coffee or who spent the money on gasoline. Let's stop that, and let's look at the value that local organizations can bring and fund that value. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a good tone and adds another important word to the discussion on localizations, which is trust. And I think that needs to be coupled with innovative mechanisms and flexibility. But I think the trust on the side of donors trying to build it, but also find a way to kind of build it and keep it is important. With that, I would like to thank the panelists, 2 of them who have come a long way to join us from here. I know it's not a painless trip, but I'm glad you are with us and you could share your experiences. Thank you, Pete, as well, for coming, and thank you for hearing us out. And I will give it over back to Refugee Council and to the organizers.